Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. In a series of nomination hearings, senior Trump administration nominees emphasized the growing threat posed by China. Today we examine how the U.S.-ROC alliance can best address the evolving threat environment in the region.
What we are doing right now is building our readiness, our capability, and our interoperability to ensure that we can defend the Republic of Korea against any threat.
It's very important. The core American interest is in denying China regional hegemony. What's changed, Senator, as we discussed, is the dramatic deterioration of the military balance.
If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them. No, I'm not going to defend them.
In the studio with me, Mr. Robert Peters, a Senior Research Fellow for Strategic Deterrence at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Peters served as the lead strategist at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He was also the Special Advisor for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Also joining us, Mr. Sidney Seiler, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Seiler was former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council. Mr. Seiler was the Special Envoy for Six-Party Talks and National Security Council Korea Director during the Obama administration. Mr. Seiler also served as Senior Analyst for U.S. Forces Korea. Mr. Seiler has worked on North Korea issues for over 40 years. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Peters, the annual Freedom Shield exercises is underway, which is defense-oriented, but strategic assets such as nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and strategic bombers are deployed in large numbers. And also, this is the first year that this is multi-domain exercise, integrating space and cyber elements. Can we assume that the US-ROK exercises are evolving into target directly China and not just North Korea?
Well, I think that those exercises are designed to defend American and Korean interests against whatever threat may present itself. I would say that China is the primary threat to the United States, and I think it is also increasingly a greater threat to South Korea. So I would have to assume that these exercises increasingly are designed to be able to deter and, if necessary, demonstrate the alliance's ability to defeat not only North Korean aggression, but also Chinese aggression.
And Mr. Peters, do you think the Iraq-U.S. joint exercises reflect strategic preparations for the possibility of coalition between North Korea, China, and Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what we have to be preparing for at this point. I mean, we've seen North Korea and Russia move increasingly close to one another, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine. As you well know, China is the primary threat to the United States. And I think that within the minds of many American defense planners, there's increasingly a view that we could see either sequential or opportunistic aggression, in which a war breaks out in one part of the world that includes activities in another part of the world. And in many of these scenarios, the actors are China or North Korea or Russia. And so I think that at least in the minds of many American defense planners, you have to develop capabilities that are credible, that are able to engage in a series of threats, no matter who is the adversary. And so I have to believe that American defense officials are talking with their South Korean counterparts and talking about the need to mature the relationship to be able to engage with a variety of threats, to include potential collaboration between North Korea and China and Russia.
China strongly criticizes U.S. ROK exercises, and if the exercises increasingly appear to be targeting China, then wouldn't that lead to even stronger cooperation between North Korea, China, and Russia?
I don't know about the cooperation itself, but we have to have a fundamental understanding of these messaging strategies that we see particularly employed by Pyongyang and Beijing. They want us to second guess our intentions to try to deter the strengthening of our alliances that are largely defensive in nature, defending against these threats in the region that they face with the growing nuclear North Korea and with China and its aggressive posture. So of course, China, at every opportunity, is going to complain about any action the United States is participating in the region or considering participating in the region, so that critics will say our actions, which are legitimate acts of self-defense, are actually hostile or offensive in nature. So understanding that, understanding the tactical dimensions of the messaging and the strategic implications help us to have the type of commitment to the types of training, the type of posture we need to deter these two very dangerous and unpredictable adversaries.
And if I may add to that, China is the one that is upsetting strategic stability within the region. They are the ones who are building 100 new nuclear weapons every year. They're the ones who are conducting pretty aggressive naval operations around Taiwan, Australia, others. They're the ones that are harassing civilian Filipino fishing vessels. They are the ones who are increasingly acting belligerent on the world stage. They can't just expect that the United States and its treaty allies to sit back and do nothing in response. So I don't have any sympathy for the Chinese in that position.
And Mr. Seiler, the first Trump administration reduced the scale of joint exercises with Korea, but this time it has been expanded. President Trump's skepticism about joint exercises not reflected in the latest round, do you think? Or is this a show of change in the Trump administration's policy towards South Korea and the region?
Well, it shows that it's no longer 2017 today, right? So when President Trump came into office, it almost coincided exactly with Moon Jae-in taking over as president with the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. And at that time period, as you recall, North Korea was in a very aggressive R&D missile launch campaign, launching Hwasong after Hwasong, moving from a short to medium, intermediate, and then an intercontinental ballistic missile. And it looked like tensions were high on the peninsula. Those of us who had seen North Korea for a number of years knew that, one, it was an R&D cycle. Two, we know what real provocation cycles look like. It didn't look like we were headed down that road. But nevertheless, President Trump inherited this issue at a time of increased tension on the peninsula. And he's hearing from North Korea, our exercises are destabilizing. He's hearing from Moon Jae-in that we need to roll back the rhetoric and the posture. And so there was a consensus that rolling back exercises at that time could contribute to diplomatic efforts that appeared briefly from the 2018 to 2019 period. We had President's emphasis on countries bearing the cost of their national defense, and of course that got mixed into the large costs that can be involved in sending B-52 bombers or a carrier strike group or having an exercise along the scale of those that we have. So then it made sense. Training went on. They were adjusted and downscaled in terms of volume of the messaging, in terms of scope of the participants. And as a result, by 2022, 2023, as North Korea resumes its missile launches and its threats, we realize we need to beef up and return to previous levels our training. And that's where we are today. Will President Trump remain committed to this level and type of training and pressure on North Korea going forward? That's hard to say because we don't know what diplomatic developments on the ground might warrant a rolling back.
And Mr. Peters, the Trump administration has approved the sale of equipment and service for Japan's hypervelocity gliding projectile program. Does the decision to transfer such sensitive technology go beyond simple military cooperation? And does it reflect a strategy to contain China?
I think there is a growing sentiment amongst American defense policymakers that we need to move past many of the restrictions on foreign military sales and technology transfers, particularly with our key allies. And so in East Asia, that goes to Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And so you're already seeing the sentiment on Capitol Hill. You're seeing the sentiment amongst think tanks. You're seeing more and more people write about this, is that we need to drop these barriers and really work with our key allies who have modern industrial economies that have similar values, similar interests, who are able to produce these capabilities. Because frankly, we need more munitions. Our key allies need more munitions. I think that's where this is headed.
And Mr. Seiler, the U.S. Forces Korea's traditional mission is to deter military threat from North Korea. But some say USFK's role is also changing toward a broader strategic goal of containing China. Now, USFK's establishment of a Space Force unit and participation in multilateral exercises outside of the Korean Peninsula is also a new change. Now, is this a sign that USFK's mission is officially shifting to include countering China?
Throughout the Cold War and up to today, a few facts have always been in play when it comes to the role and purpose of U.S. Forces Korea. One is the very real possibility, going back to the Cold War, that we could have had some type of U.S.-USSR conflict in which there would have been a Far Eastern front, whereas naturally that would have brought into combat, U.S. Forces Korea, because they're present in the region, they bring capabilities that as much as we tailor them and train them to scenarios on the peninsula could help U.S. Efforts in areas around the region. The other constant has been the possibility that China would become involved, as it did in the Korean War, with any contingency on the peninsula. For many years, we didn't talk about it, but we knew it was a realistic, what we call third-party intervention possibility, so that U.S. Forces Korea would have to consider scenarios on the peninsula that would involve some type of conflict with China. And so here we are today. As Bob mentioned over and over, it is clear that as much as North Korea's nuclear threat is growing and the rhetoric from Kim Jong-un seems endless, in China we have an even more larger growing capability and a stronger articulation to take actions to resolve the Taiwan issue that makes the possibility of some type of military conflict between the United States and China much more likely, and of course, in terms of the scale of the preparations required, much more urgent for the incoming administration. So I think U.S. Forces Korea will continue to have that central mission, obviously, of supporting the ROK in its defense against North Korea aggression. But the fact is that U.S. Forces Korea troops are American soldiers, airmen, Marines on the ground, and sailors, and they need to be ready for a conflict wherever the president, the commander-in-chief would say they're needed.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Peters, Mr. Seiler mentioned the China threat, and Mr. Elbridge Colby, the nominee for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, has argued in previous interviews that USFK's role should be changed to deal more with the Chinese PLA, and the U.S. military should not be held hostage to the Korean Peninsula. If the USFK's mission shifts to contain China, wouldn't it become even more important to station U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula given the geographical proximity? And if the USFK becomes more useful in containing China, doesn't that contradict the speculations that USFK could be reduced?
Well, I certainly don't speak for Mr. Colby. What I would say is that I don't think that it is American policy to contain China. I think it is American interest and American policy to deter conflict and, if necessary, defeat aggression. And so in that sense, is it possible that USFK can be evolving into a force that can deter conflict or deter aggression from not only North Korea, but also China or potentially Russia? I think that is appropriate. And moreover, I would offer that would be appropriate for South Korea's military as well. I think it is high time that South Korea sees itself as not simply an isolated actor on a peninsula that faces an aggressive and dangerous North Korea, but a more mature actor that looks across the board, across its region, and says, I need to be able to deter aggression from any actor, not only North Korea, but potentially to include China. And I think once South Korea makes that decision, then I think a lot more opportunities open up for both nations to mutually support each other's interests and have a more credible deterrent posture.
And Mr. Seiler, given North Korea's sophistication of nuclear and missile weapons, North Korean threat alone, doesn't that give more of a reason for USFK to be strengthened?
Military capabilities that the United States brings to a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, as everyone knows, are not limited to those that are on the ground in the 28,500 troops today. involves Navy and Air Forces that are off the peninsula. It involves the nuclear capabilities that would support extended deterrence. There's many ways in which the United States can respond to a growing North Korea threat, and it's not necessarily by seeking to increase from 28,500 troops to even higher numbers. The more troops on the ground, the more you kind of lose a little bit of flexibility should there be scenarios in other theaters. There's limitations to how much the training facilities on the ground can accommodate the levels of training necessary to have qualified gunners, pilots, et cetera. So I would not draw a straight line from a growing nuclear threat qualitatively or quantitatively and the appropriate number of troops on the peninsula per se.
And if I could add to that, I don't really see American Army forces as being what's needed within the theater. I mean, I think that the Air Forces and the Naval forces are far more valuable. So I think it's possible that you could see an increased American air presence on the peninsula that's designed to deter or defeat North Korean aggression, but also Chinese aggression. And that air presence could include airframes, but it could also include more and more diverse types of munitions.
So both of you agree that USFK should be transformed into more air and naval forces heavy so that it can be more agile to threats around the region, whereas currently it's more army focused because it's deterring against North Korean threat?
I mean, we've only got like one combat brigade on the peninsula right now. And even that's not even a combat brigade. It's a very specific mission that's not really to engage North Korean forces. So most of the actual American combat forces that are on the peninsula are actually air assets today.
Well, remember, there's important roles for U.S. ground troops on the ground as well. Even if you assume that the majority of the ground game will be executed by a very capable, very well-equipped Republic of Korea Army, there's still challenges in the rear area security, making sure you've secured your lines of communication by which you'll bring in forces and you'll exfil NEO, non-combatant evacuation operations. So there's still a need for the mix, and I think the mix today, there's been no change in any of this over the past several years that would necessitate a major reexamination of it. But I do believe that if Bridge Colby and others are correct, that we need to look at U.S. Forces Korea in terms of its potential contributions to a China-Taiwan scenario, then we need to examine, okay, what is it that will be needed that isn't there right now, right? And then see, where that might be changed or transformed. This is beyond the air bases. We know that U.S. will want to use, the large base at Camp Humphreys that we know is in an ideal location for supporting logistics in this scenario. I mean, we know all these important roles that will be played by the existing force mix, but are there other changes going forward? I haven't heard of any in particular other than the statements that Elbridge Colby has made in terms of needing to think about U.S. Forces Korea in terms of how it contributes to the China scenario.
And Mr. Peters, if U.S. Forces Korea contributes more to the China scenario than for the South Korean taxpayers, wouldn't they think there is less of a justification for South Korea's host nation support for the USFK?
I think that the American perspective is that USFK and South Korean military, it is appropriate to widen the aperture, to look at security threats within the region. Maybe indeed those come from North Korea, but maybe they come from elsewhere, such as China. I agree with Sid in that the South Korean army is more than capable of handling the North Korean army at this point. Like I don't see, if it's purely conventional fight, I don't see the North Korean army as being able to take and hold large swaths of South Korea itself. They can impose damage on it, and that is a problem, to be sure, but that damage can be mitigated through airstrikes and air power and counter battery fire to destroy those elements that are holding, in particular, Seoul at risk. But I do think that it is appropriate to look beyond and say, what do we need to deter? What are the bad threats within the region? That includes North Korea, absolutely. but it includes other actors as well. I think it's part of South Korea becoming a larger power and a larger player within the region.
So, Mr. Seiler, members of South Korea's ruling party are once again raising the need to secure nuclear latency. Seoul mayor and the chairman of the ruling party and the head of the Emergency Leadership Committee have all stressed that securing nuclear latency is the most realistic solution to the North Korean nuclear threat. Is it possible that such a voice calling for South Korea's nuclear capabilities could become a source of contention with the Trump administration, or could it be more in line with President Trump's view of promoting allies' stronger defense capabilities?
I've seen nothing, and Bob, you can speak to this, in the president's view on the issue of proliferation and expanded possession of nuclear capabilities by allies or non-allies alike. But it is certainly, as I said before, I think it's a welcome conversation and debate, because it's not one that's going to be solved or satisfy anybody's desires by being hidden or avoided. I continue to believe that the risk to South Korea's security that would come the minute it started moving down the path of a nuclear program, in particular, if it looked like it was doing so without the support and approval of the United States, it puts itself immediately at risk, because North Korea is put in a use or lose scenario to act first, to take the first step before South Korea develops this capability. But again, I believe that this is an area that, Bridge Colby, in pre-confirmation remarks that he would make, would address this issue. So we know that at least some senior policymakers will be willing to give it an open discussion. But my position on the value of this really hasn't changed.
And Mr. Peters, in Korea, there is growing perception that nuclear armament is a matter of national survival, whereas here in the United States, there is view that South Korea's nuclear drive undermines regional stability. How do you assess these two logics?
Well, what I'd say is that if I were South Korean, I would absolutely want to have a nuclear guarantee. We in the United States try to address that by having the extended nuclear umbrella over South Korea. I think that's appropriate. I think that should continue. And I think that if it was made more credible, that nuclear umbrella was made more credible, that might address some of the legitimate concerns that the people of South Korea hold, and could address some of this desire for nuclear latency.
So, Mr. Peters, some argue that this growing voice in South Korea of wanting to have nuclear weapons could be helpful in U.S.'s efforts to pressure China to help in denuclearizing North Korea. What is your take on that?
Well, I think that if Washington wanted South Korea to get nuclear capabilities that would then pressure China, that would then pressure North Korea to then denuclearize, there's a lot of ifs that have to go right to make that work. And so I just can't imagine that there's a lot of people that would say, well, we should go down this path. That's like a quadruple bank shot in pool that usually does not work well.
Mm. Yeah. And Mr. Seiler, under the current U.S.-Korea Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, South Korea cannot reprocess spent fuel rods or extract plutonium, but Japan can. And some Koreans say the 123 agreement should be revised to match Japan's. Is there a realistic possibility that Washington will accept that?
I think it's something, again, an area that from South Korea's own sovereignty perspective and equity with Japan, that is certainly something that should be discussed. It's not helpful when it's usually discussed within the context of securing nuclear latency, when it's clear that the reason you want the ability to reprocess and enrich is so that you can develop potential fissile nuclear weapons usable fissile material. So I think it is an area that needs to be carefully thought through within the context of what you said. If Japan can have this, why not the Republic of Korea?
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Seiler, Mr. Peters, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.